Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's lecture. We're going to be taking a look at today the history of electronic music production. So we're in our third unit now. We're looking at electronic music production. And just like in the beginning of the course, grounding the broader conversation around music technology, around the history of the subject, I want to look specifically at synthesis and sampling and sequencing, these sort of key units, key ideas we'll be looking at in this unit, and look at the evolution of all of those and how in our modern day they kind of converge with the digital audio workstation. So essentially, we'll look at the history of electronic music through the lens of technology, the techniques of making music that evolved from the use of those technologies, right? So as we've seen, technology is not just neutral, right? It just doesn't allow us to do the things that we already do. It also opens up new potentials for making music, and then those new potentials make new styles of music or new forms of music making. So that's sort of our lens and our philosophy for the lesson today. We'll look at things like the mellotron, which came out in 1963. We looked a little bit at that in the first lesson as well, and how that evolved into something today like Native Instruments Contact. This idea of being able to play samples on tape has evolved into being able to store samples in digital memory. Now, Native Instruments Contact is much more flexible and much more expandable than the mellotron, but the basic principle remains the same, right? We're storing a sound in some medium to be able to play later with a keyboard-like device to be able to make music with it. First, let's look at synthesis. So what is synthesis? A synthesizer is an electronic musical instrument that creates sounds by generating waveforms. Common synthesis types include subtractive synthesis, additive synthesis, and frequency modulation synthesis. So this could be an entire course onto itself, talking about all the different techniques of synthesis. We'll be exploring some great tools from Ableton and some other online resources that kind of help you dive a little bit deeper into it. But just know right now, the basic idea of the synthesizer is it has some sort of electronics inside of it that are generating a waveform, similar to how a acoustic instrument has some means of sound production. But here we're looking at purely electronic sound production, not reproducing a recorded sound, but coming up with a new sound that is made purely electronically. So analog synthesis, an analog synthesizer uses analog circuits and analog signals to generate sound electronically. So there's no digital memory, there's no programming, there's no computer code. This is just works based on different circuits and transistors. The earliest synthesizers were built in the 1920s and 30s. Early models were large, often taking up entire rooms, sort of paralleling how computers worked at this time. Computers were found maybe in universities or in the Department of Defense, and they took up entire rooms, right? Synthesizers sort of had a similar trajectory where they were very large to begin with. Advances in technology allowed for more portable units, which gained popularity with musicians in the 1960s and 1970s. So as you see in the 1960s, folks like the Beatles, and David Bowie and other artists began to incorporate synths into their music. A lot of the prog bands in the 1970s, synthesizers were common by that point. And it really comes down to, can you take this thing into the studio? Can you take this thing on tour, right? So the Mini Moog by Robert Moog in 1970 was one synthesizer that really opened that up, right? This wasn't going to just take up, a whole room. It was something that could easily be put onto onto a stand and brought on stage. Let's see if we can hear just a little bit of that synth. So very kind of classic sound that we hear there, and that's using the subtractive synthesis method, which we'll dive a little bit more into when we look at our Ableton lessons. Later on, you have things that are digital synthesizers. So they use digital signal processing to make musical sounds. Digital synthesis techniques include additive, frequency modulation, and wavetable. Wavetable similar to subtractive, but is able to use more complex waves, not just your triangle, square, saw, these very simple patterns. The earliest digital synthesizer was developed by Yamaha Corporation in Japan in 1974, but it was really the DX7, which was released in 1983, that became the first widely available, commonly used digital synthesizers. These became ubiquitous in popular music, also in musical theater, They were great in a pit band because they could do lots of different sounds. They could do your bells, they could do your electric piano, they could do a bass guitar. These don't sound exactly like the physical versions of them, but they have a very iconic character, a lot of these sounds. I always say that if you've heard any Christmas music from the 1980s, you've heard the DX7. Let's give a quick listen to that. So the sound you heard there, that's the sort of classic DX7 Rhodes. So the DX7 trying to recreate the sound of a Rhodes, which was an earlier electric piano, but it had a brighter, very sort of vibrant sound, different from the original Rhodes, which was like a warmer kind of, purer sound. So it became very popular onto itself. Any pop ballad, R&B ballad from that time used that sound. Go ahead here. Sequencers. So obviously with keyboards, with the keyboard-based synthesizers, we can play them just like a piano. We can play them one-handed and have one hand free to do knobs, or if it's a polyphonic synthesizer like the DX7, we can play it just like a piano. But sometimes we want to create a musical pattern that we want to repeat. This is an essential feature of music, that started sort of in the disco era and went through house and techno. It's like, how can you just have a pattern that repeats, freeing up both hands to explore changing timbre, programming drums? Sequencers became an essential part of music, and they allowed us to store a musical pattern and play it back with variations. So the first sequencers were not digital at all, but were controlled by voltage. So basically, to define what a sequencer is the device or software application that can record, edit, or play back music by handling note and performance information, typically control voltage or MIDI. So you can say, here's your pattern. Your pattern could be all the same note. Right? So that's a very simple pattern, but you can also change other parameters. So even just that pattern where you're repeating one note, you could say, accent the first note. Right? Or you could have a filter sweep. You could have the timbre change over time. So with a sequencer, you can control both notes and expression. I'll have this video down below in your D2L module. So these things start to evolve. And one really famous example and a really great story of history of electronic music would be the Roland 303 bass machine. So the Roland 303 bass line was released by Roland in 1981. It was designed to simulate bass guitars, but it was a commercial failure and discontinued in 1984. However, secondhand units were adopted by electronic musicians for its squelching or chirping sound that became the foundations of electronic dance music such as acid house, Chicago house, and techno. So I love this example because technology opens up possibilities, and sometimes those possibilities are not even what the creators of that technology intended. The Roland 303 is perhaps the best example of that, where they made something that was going to recreate the sound of the electric bass. Now, electric bass sounds really good, and there's a lot of bass players, right? And they do a lot of gigs, right? I always envy bass players because they're always gigging. So we don't really need to recreate bass players, but if we could make something that does something totally different and opens up new creative possibilities, particularly for those people who are not trained in, music theory and that sort of thing, musicians from outside of the typical music training field, if it gives them a way to express themselves, like these musicians who are creating these genres of electronic music, that was where the real magic happened. Let's listen to a little bit of the sound of the 303. So we heard there on the 303 that it doesn't sound anything like a bass guitar. And basically the way you'd work with it is you'd first program your pattern and then you'd play the pattern. But as you're playing it, you could use your hands to control those knobs so you get that timbral variation. Now, Roland had these sort of sequence-based instruments, and they had a whole series. So you can see also here similar naming conventions, the TR-808 and TR-909. These are drum sequencers. So just like you could sequence a bass line, you could sequence drums. Now, these also went on to be a huge sort of, groundbreaking, genre-establishing pieces of technology. The 808 and things like early hip hop, also in techno music, was huge. And then the 909 came out just a year later and added very basic sampling. So a lot of the sounds like the snare and the kick were synthesized, but things like the bass drum, things like the hi-hat rather, were samples. So combined synthesis and sampling. These sounds, right? Musicians will even call these out in their lyrics. Sometimes they'll talk about 808s, 909s, just showing how much they're beloved in these sort of electronic music, hip hop and hip hop communities. Let's listen to a little bit of each of those. It's an example of the 808. I love the 808 cowbell. It doesn't sound like a cowbell, but it has its own unique character. That hi-hat really gives the 909 that its distinct quality. Really classic in any kind of dance music. Great. So all these technologies sort of are all evolving and using their own sort of ways of talking, right? We have Moog using voltage control, Roland early devices sort of having their own sort of like protocols. But it's really in 1982 that we have something that sort of says, well, what if we can get all of these devices by all of these different manufacturers to be able to communicate with one another, to be able to play at the same tempo, to be able to synchronize and send messages to one another. So we get this protocol called MIDI. So MIDI is short for Musical Instrument Digital Interface, and is a communications protocol that allows for digital instruments and computers to share musical information and playback with one another. It was introduced in 1982 and still used today. MIDI 2.0 was introduced at NAMM in 2020. Features higher resolution of data and is slowly being adopted by music manufacturers and software developers. MIDI 2.0, MPE, those are things, if you're interested in this topic, worth researching. They're definitely kind of emerging technologies that have been a little bit slow to adopt. I think MIDI is really powerful, but it does have its limitations. So these sort of newer technologies are trying to overcome some limitations and have a more sort of granular approach to expression and that sort of thing. I will have this video below. Here's a great video by Herbie Hancock, collaboration with Apple, talking about MIDI and music, early applications of, right, we know MIDI can communicate with computers, so using computers as sort of the conductor, right, storing all the information, having the score, and then different MIDI keyboards or devices sort of being the performers. So really great video, sort of a very of the times that it was released. So definitely worth checking that out. Check that out below. Great. Take a breath. We've covered a lot of information so far. Feel free to grab a coffee or another caffeinated beverage. We're going to be taking a look at samplers here. So samplers, what is a sampler? A sampler is an electronic or digital musical instrument that uses sound recordings of real instrument sounds, excerpts from recorded songs or found sounds. So whereas the synthesizer sort of is a fixed, closed system, right? On your Moog synthesizer, you can't import a new waveform, right? A sampler is sort of open to the world of sounds in that you can add new sounds to it. You could sing into a microphone, and now you could play yourself singing across the keys. You could record your cat. You could record a bird, or you could record the sound of a door slamming. It's really a more open-ended form of sound that requires being able to store sound on some medium. Samples are loaded and recorded by the user and manufacturer into digital memory. These sounds are then played back on a MIDI keyboard, sequencer, and another triggering device. So the sort of what I like to call proto-sampler is the mellotron, and we looked at this in our introduction unit. We'll do a quick review on it. So here's a picture of the mellotron. It's pretty small. You have like an octave and a half, sort of similar to like a toy piano range. You have a few knobs here that can control which bank of sounds you're controlling. They could often store, you could have your flutes, your violins, your choir would be another typical sound you'd find on there. And here's the sort of mechanism by which you play it, which is kind of really simple and also genius. It has, if you imagine a cassette tape, so it has your sort of tape here, and here's your tape head that reads the cassette. It has a weight here. As you press on the key, the weight sort of pulls that tape down and plays the cassette. So you had an 8-second loop. So you got to be careful if you're doing sustained chords for a few measures. It'll just sort of stop. It'll peter out and stop after 8 seconds. So players would be strategic in how they were re-articulating chords. But really cool. So each key was controlling its own head of tape. Very interesting setup. They were very expensive, found sort of in the studios of big artists, but it wasn't like you could easily get your hands on one of these at the time they came out. Feel free to pause if you want to read through the prompt there. The Fairlight CMI. So let's skip ahead about 15 years or so. And now computers have advanced to the point where we could use computers as samplers, synthesizers, sort of proto digital audio workstation almost. So the CMI, or computer music instrument, was a digital synthesizer, sampler, and audio workstation introduced in 1979. One of the earliest workstations with an embedded sampler, so you could put your own sounds in it. Rose to prominence in the early 1980s, competed with a Synclavier from New England Digital. The Fairlight was priced at about 18 grand for the base model. just for some context there, I have the average median household in 1979, right? So this instrument, while very cool and very capable, is not having the impact, right? You're not finding this in classrooms, or most colleges might not even have it. You will find this at, EMI Records or Warner Brothers Records or that sort of thing. So you'll hear it on Michael Jackson records or Kate Bush records, that sort of thing. But you're not, your average garage band musician or hobbyist has no access to this. But it is innovating. It is sort of pushing things forward in a way that will be impactful later, right? This is a sort of trend you'll see a lot of technologies, is that they start very expensive, only available to a few, and then later technological innovations sort of open that up to a price point that it's available to the general public. Example of that, here we go. So the iKite MPC 60, so we're moving forward about 10 years here. The first MPCs were designed by Roger Lynn, who aimed to create an intuitive instrument with a grid of pads to be played similarly to a keyboard or drum kit. So you see this sort of iconic 4x4 grid here that allowed you to store 16 different samples. Those could be drum samples, those could be bass or chord hits. So you could really create an entire musical production with those samples. You had various controls of parameters and tempos, and you could apply effects or filters to different sounds. So the MPC had a major influence on the development of electronic dance music and hip hop. It had a democratizing effect on music production, allowing artists to create elaborate tracks without traditional instruments or recording studios. So you could hook anything up to this. You could hook a CD player up to it. You could hook a vinyl player up to it. You could hook a mixer with a microphone or a guitar up to it. It really allowed for all types of audio. So it was very important in hip hop because whatever folks had around, if they just had a record player, you plug your record player, chop things up, isolate different sounds, and you're making beats. Notable users of the MPC include DJ Shadow, Jay Dilla, and Kanye West. So let's think about some connections. How do hardware, synthesizers, samplers, and sequencers impact how we produce music today? There's going to be a discussion forum below where you guys can put some thoughts on this. This won't be a graded forum, just sort of an informal discussion. Think about, what we just learned. How does this impact the way we produce music today? So what I think is that you can see a lot of these things in your DAWs. I'm going to have some examples here. The primary DAW I use is Logic, so I have some Logic examples here. The same thing can be found in Soundtrap. The same thing can be found in GarageBand or other DAWs. So you'll find synthesizers within your DAWs, right? Ways of producing sound using waveforms that will have controls. Some of them, like this vintage synth, will even be designed to look like these classic synths. There's even examples of companies making digital replicas of classic synthesizers. Sequencers. Every DAW will have some form of sequencers. Some are so well known for their sequencers that they're really beloved by beat producers because they have a very great and intuitive design, similar to, thinking about the MPC. Programs like FL Studio or Ableton are really known for their abilities to work well in electronic music production. The other manufacturers, the software developers, pay attention to these things. You could see the sort of beat production here in Logic, or we have an earlier version of that here. Samplers, right? Logic has various modes of sampling, and you can find this in other DAWs where you can quickly take any sound, anything that you record, throw it in, and be able to play it up and down a keyboard. They also will have advanced samplers that allow you to put different layers of sound. So you could say, I'm going to record all of my keys on my piano, or some of my keys on my piano, and record them very quiet, then sort of at a medium, and then at a high volume, and then you could set it so you can trigger your MIDI keyboard to play those samples at those different velocities. Here's an example of the sampler. You can see those different velocities, your quieter velocities here, and then you can see 1, 2, 3 additional velocity layers called zones, and then you have your groups. There is a whole industry of folks who make what are called virtual instruments. When you listen to anything on TV or any film that's been produced, The majority of that stuff is virtual instruments. Obviously, bigger budget films will bring in a live orchestra, but often composers have created mock-ups to get approved by the director that use these technologies. If you're watching a more like documentary or a series on TV, it's probably not orchestra. It's probably virtual orchestras. They're very good these days. It's a very interesting sort of zone. If you compose music for wind ensemble or for choir and you want to have ways of getting realistic mock-ups of that, definitely look into companies like Native Instruments, who creates Contact, or East West Sounds. I'll have these links down below as well. Here's some further investigations. So thank you for taking the time to kind of do this deep dive into electronic music history, the devices that sort of changed the way we make music. Hope you found this valuable. It's, to me, very, very interesting stuff, and I think it's important to ground any investigation of the current landscape through historical lens. Great. See you guys in the next one.